up to this point, that when we are referring to the steady state, it is a definition I gave you guys earlier. That is, the steady state is the state that once we are there, we are going to stay there forever, and then once we deviate away from it, we are going to go back to it. So then what does the concept of once we are there, we are going to stay there, what does it mean in terms of the values? Well, you say, well, it's quite straightforward that if we are there, we are going to stay there forever, then it means that the number should be exactly the same. That is true, which is associated with the narrowly defined steady state. We say that for the narrowly defined steady state, all the variables remain the same under the model. But why, when we have been talking about the Solow model, we didn't emphasize this concept that much? That is because we know under the Solow model, once we know the value of the K, then we know the value of the output, investment, and the consumption. As long as the value of the capital stock is in the steady state, that is, it remains the same, then all the value will also be the same. So then we did not emphasize too much about how does all the variable change over time. But we know that once we have the capital stock in the steady state, that is, once it hit the point and it stay there, then it will always be the same. So for sure, all the other variables are remain the same. So the economy is at a steady state. So then you will say, hey, wait a minute. But then in the model that we introduced earlier, we allow the population growth. When there is a population growth, then it means that at least the population somehow is not the same over time. So then in fact, we are adopting another concept which is called the broadly defined steady state. We say that for the broadly defined steady state, all the variables grow at a constant rate, and which we call is on the balanced growth path. So then, if we look at the broadly defined steady state, now we know for an economy that is at a steady state, it will, once it's there, it's going to stay there forever. But this state that will stay forever is that the growth rate is the same over the time. So then, under this new definition, we know that as long as the capital stock in the steady state is growing at a constant rate, for example 2%, then for all the other variables, given that it is a function of the capital stock, so then it will also grow. Due to the format of the set of the equations, it may not grow at the same rate. It may grow at 2%, it may grow at 1%, but it's okay. As long as they are growing at a constant rate, then it is on the balanced growth path. So then you say, hey, then what happened to our steady state defined earlier? Well, for the steady state we defined earlier is also more of the broadly defined steady state, but somehow in the previous discussion we focus on all the per capita variables because we look at the per capita variable. So when it is at a steady state, the growth of the population somehow got crossed out. So then we can think about that the discussion we have related to the steady state is more related to the narrowly defined steady state. After this part, I'm going to introduce the model that with population growth and the technological growth. Therefore, I need to introduce the concept of the broadly defined steady state. And then we are going to talk about how we will take care of the issue of steady state in the graph and the computations. But for the time being, in here we say we have the narrowly defined steady state. That is, if the economy is at a steady state, all the variables remain the same. But then we introduce another concept, which is the broadly defined steady state. We say that all the variables will grow at a constant rate. So then the narrowly defined steady state is a subset of the broadly defined steady state. That is because if the growth rate equals 0 for all the variables, then it's still consistent with the broadly defined steady state, except that the growth rate now is constant at the rate 0. So both of them are delivering the concept of the steady state. One is the narrowest defined, so all the variables are always the same at the steady state. But then for the broadly defined steady state, we somehow allow it to grow. And as long as it's growing at a constant rate, then we still claiming that the economy is a steady state that constantly grow over time. So now let's move on to talk about the solo model with population growth and the technological growth. And in there, we need to adopt the concept of the broadly defined steady state.